got another video. This one's about the sisters in anime. I got sisters from, different animes ranked from worst to best. So at 18, I have Nebra. Who's Nebra? Nebra is the sister of Noelle Silva. If you know anything about Nebra, she don't like Noelle. She ain't that close to him. She is closer to her brothers, but she's just like there, not holding down really good for, Silva. Noelle does that better than she does, but, she has enough magical power to, be, a member of the Silver Eagles at the beginning of the series, but then later on, when shit, gets serious and the elves are attacking, she's one that's, asking her brother for help, which is fine because that's her brother, but, he, needs her to, be able to hold down for herself. And Noelle, ended up coming to save her younger sister, who she hates. She hates her younger sister. She don't like her. And to my knowledge, and I didn't read the manga, this girl has not, grown closer to Noelle or anything. So I got her at number 20 or 18. At 17, I have Azula. You could flop these two out if you wanted to, but she was more favored by Ozai because she wanted to see the world burn, and she wanted to help her father out with his grand vision. Azula didn't like her. She played games with people. She played mind games. She manipulated people. She even manipulated Zuko with his honor. She was like, please, Zuko, come back. After, she tried to, hunt them down and shit too. She made them, fugitives of the Fire Nation for a little bit. But then she came to him with the offer. She was like, you have to come back, brother, and like trying to pull out his heartstrings a little bit. Like, you can, do this. We can take down the Avatar together. She then, got Zuko back, but then Zuko is, still, talking about their uncle. And she was like, she don't really give a fuck about that. They had their, time together on Ember Island where they kind of, were a little bit buddy when they, destroyed that one guy's, party, and they fucked that shit up. But after that, and then that time they took down Avatar Aang together, but it was mostly her doing that. She's just, a bratty little sister. He had to put her down. She actually shot her brother, almost killed him with lightning. She was trying to shoot Katara down, but Zuko jumped in the way. She didn't feel any type of way about Zuko, almost dying by lightning. I got that girl at 17. I got 16. I got Sorano at 17 or 16. This is the sister of Yukino from Fairy Tail. Now, they were sisters. They were together, but then they got separated. She was taken to the Tower Harbour. Sorano was, and then, I guess she kind of like wrote her sister off. She kind of had to, but she was in a dark guild for a while. She grew with the power of darkness, whereas Yukino, she did similarly, but Yukino was just a better person, more kind and gentle, whereas Sorano wasn't. She was like, I don't have a sister. When she first meet her, my sister, what? You ain't my sister. But then, deep down, she was denying her sister and shit too when she first figured out she had her sister didn't die or anything. She was in disbelief. She was like, I don't have a sister. She's running with the Ration face. and because of that, I have to put her at 16. You don't deny that shit. 15, I have Miss Armstrong, not Miss Armstrong, but General Armstrong, right? She's a decent swordsman. She's a Briggs General, right? And her brother Alex is a major, right? And she's actually the more powerful of the two. But she understands that her brother, could stand to be more, strong, like an Armstrong should be. But if I feel like if Alex ever died, she would be like, write it off as, he was a fool. My brother was foolish because he, shown weakness, and he wasn't, doing and standing on business like a man should. Which she might be right, but at the end of the day, I'm like, that's kind of harsh, as a big sister, and maybe she does feel about it because she felt about that one guy who died, Buccaneer, that guy who lost his arm to Fewer Bradley, and then if he died, but she wouldn't show it or anything like she wouldn't burst into. She would do that shit like in like where nobody else was when she's by herself. She would just start crying. That's what she would do. But these other females on the list are just better. I got Mei Mei at 14. I have Mei Mei low because we know that this girl likes money. She took Uiui with her to Shibuya. And I'm not saying that she would, but if the money was right, she might leave her brother somewhere and be like, you have to, do your thing, and if anything gets, you have to call me, or something, or, she wouldn't take him with her, or I don't know. If the money was right, she might have to leave him somewhere, and go get that money, I don't know. I don't think she's, and that's just the vibes I get from her. I think she might like money more than, a little bit. If the money's right, she might be out of there, you know. And she ain't a bad sister, y'all. I'm kind of playing games a little bit because these other females on the list are better sisters than her. She did protect him in Shibuya. They work together. They have a connection together. Better than the people below her. But the ones above her just do it better. Like Alluka and Killua. Nanaka, she's the one, or the other, or, alter ego or whatever, can kill people. And that's why she's at 13. She don't have that relationship with her other brothers. She would kill her other brothers. Illumi could die. Maluki and Kalata could die too. But Killua would never. She loves Killua. She would do anything Killua said. Killua told her to never come out again, Nanika. And then Alluka was like, hey, you can't do that, sir. And then, Killua was like, you know what? I don't hate Nanika. I just don't want her being, used by the family, in the negative way. And he, was there for her. They have a strong connection as brother and sister. But her connection with the other brothers and sisters are not that strong. So I have to give her some negative points for that. And I understand she's a younger sister too. But that is what I have it as. But at 12, I got Tatsumaki. They're both, her sister's a hero too. But she's in the shadow of, or Tatsumaki is the one that is the powerful, and she's ranked number 2. Only Blast is ahead of her as far as the rank goes. And then Saitama's there too, right? But she had to come save her sister, from, enemies that she couldn't handle. Fubuki is the number 1 hero in B rank, and she's trying to be, she could move up if she wanted to, but she wants to be the best in her area. So she's the head of the B, tier heroes. She wants to like run that shit. Since she's number one, she can tell them what to do, and kind of like a Maya Mask. A Maya Mask could also be a S class hero probably, but he wants to be an A class hero so he can like boss around the other A class, you know, and be like, if you're an A class, you gotta be on my level. You have to be able to do what I can do. She's doing shit like that. Tatsumaki is, being a real hero out here, and, her sister, she knows that her sister's better than her, and, or Fubuki understands, or Tatsumaki knows that her sister is worse than she is, as far as, being powerful and everything else goes. She's, younger sister. She was there for her. But, she has other things to deal with. They don't have a close connection. It ain't like she's, like, encouraging her sister to, move past. She ain't doing that. She ain't saying, you need to do this, do that, She ain't trying to, like, be her cheerleader and shit, That's what a really good sister would do, right? She ain't doing that. So I'm like, I have to give her points off. These other sisters are just better than Tatsumaki. But she's better than the people below her. At 11, I got Elizabeth from Seven Deadly Sins. She cares about her sisters when they appear. See, she went on her adventure to find Meliodas and shit or whatever and be with the Seven Deadly Sins. And then her sisters come to find her, and then, like, her sister ended up dying. Veronica, she came back. She didn't die. She was just really injured. And then the other sister, I'm trying to remember, Veronica, and then the other one that got possessed by Ladociel. An angel took over her body, and she knew who that angel was, and she's like, she shows concern, but like, her actions created, problems for her sisters. She could have been like, don't even worry about me, don't like do too much for me. I'll come back with, whenever, and you, other things. But also, I also understand this too. But that's the thing about Elizabeth though. She's an angel too. So she knows actually more than what, they do about shit. Really, she does. She could have been like what I'm saying. She could have been like, stay back and, stay with our father and make sure he's okay. Because he's old and cracked out. She could have done that, and been like, I'll come back. But then her sisters went on an adventure to find her. And then, she was seeking, help from the goddess clan. And she ended up getting her body taken. She said, and her life was on the line, and that was all for Elizabeth, because she likes Meliodas, and her sisters are more support. What I'm saying is, for her, Elizabeth ain't as supportive of her sisters as her sisters are more supporting her than she's supporting them, and that's what I see, and I ain't saying she's a bad person, there's better females on this list, that's all, as far as being a good sibling to her sister or brothers if she had any. But number 10, I got Android 18. Android 18 was close to her brother. They both went in and became androids together. We're going to become the strongest, humans on this planet. It's going to be fun. And she was like, yeah, I'm cool with it. And then, they came out. They, turned on their creator because they wanted to, run shit themselves. As they should. They were boxed in for like a couple years and shit, and they didn't like that feeling. They didn't need turned the fuck off, So then they, run around and they're doing their thing. And, after the Cell Saga, everything, Android 17 gets absorbed, and then 18 gets absorbed. She comes out, he comes out, or he comes back to life. He's just gone, and she's, gone. They end up meeting again in the Tournament of Power. and they're fighting together, like side by side, like they used to. But it's for the greater good, you know. But she's not like, really like, hey, bro, come to the, cookouts and shit like that, before that shit, before the Tournament of Power, you know. And to my knowledge, she didn't, congratulate her brother for winning the Tournament of Power because he was the one that won that shit. She wasn't saying, hey, you saved our fucking by, being the last one standing, in the ring, you know. But, she's still, decent. She was, it was him and her, and then when Krillin came in there, it kind of, made their relationship a little bit worse. But it's getting better though, because, they found out what he was doing. He kind of like did his own thing and went off, but like she could have like sought her brother out more. But she also had kids and shit, so, but she still could have been like, my brother and shit, because they were close and shit, yeah. But number 9, I got Reiju. Reiju, she cares about her family, but she understood that Sanji was the weak link out of them when they were kids, and that he wouldn't have a good life there. She had to kind of be harsh and tell him to leave, but she was crying telling him that she didn't want to see her brother leave, but she understood that if he stayed there, it would be hell for him. And she was like, just get the fuck out of here. You just, you would have a better life out there, Now she could have, maybe, stood on business and said, my, brother Sanji ain't a bad person. We gotta, keep him around. You're being too harsh. You could have went to her dad and said some shit like that, but she didn't, but she stuck around her other brothers and, kept them alive, which is, not a great thing, but it's a good thing, as far as, she's a sister to all of her brothers. She don't want to see any of her brothers, go down. Even during Whole Cake Island, they had to fight against the Big Mom Pirates. She didn't want to see any of them die. She sent Sandy off on a good note there too. And out of all of Sandy's siblings, she's the one that's close to, because they had the like closer relationship to their mother. She had a close relationship to the mother and father, and then she, I guess she kind of got that part of their mother, and it was like, I want to see us all be together, but I understand that how they are, and whenever you want to see, I guess, you can talk to me, that type of thing. But number 8, I got Boa Hancock. Boa Hancock had her sisters together. They went through hell together. They were slaves in Mirajane, and then, Fisher Tiger saved them. After that day, Boa Hancock was like, I have to stand on business and protect my sisters. They'll stand right beside me at all times, and we'll be at sea together as pirates. And she was, doing that shit as Kuja pirates. And they're seen together, and they're, understood that they would, fight for one another. But it's not like always shown, and it's always, it ain't emphasized enough. So I got her at number 8. And it's shown, but it ain't emphasized like enough, like the other ones. Like I say, Rukia's at number 7. Rukia Kuchiki, was adopted into the clan. See, her sister Sane took care of her for a little bit, and then Byakuya found her and, made her, his wife, and then she died. And then Byakuya understood that she was out there, and she came into the Soul Reaper Academy. He said, no, she can come with me. She's just like Isana and stuff. But like she had to, he calls to, the ways of Byakuya, and she did. He calls to the Kuchi clan. She's like, I understand if I, I like whatever I do is gonna make my brother look bad, and she did feel bad. She felt bad. You can tell. When Byakuya came to go pick her up, to get her executed, she was gonna take that on. She was like, I understand I let you down, brother. I guess, my head's gonna roll, you know, because that shit's, disgraceful in the eyes of the clan, and just, being a Soul Reaper in general, we hold ourselves to a higher standard. Now I've let you down, and she was gonna like, take that. She was gonna like let her life, burn out. And then later on, when, Byakuya, was kind of like less like dumb about shit, too dumb about shit, he still did that, he's still like, you're a Kuchiki member, and, all of that. And she understood that, she's a Soul Reaper, she has to fight and, be outstanding, amongst the other Soul Reapers. She eventually became a lieutenant too, but then she also obtained Bankai. She fought against Asnod and defeated him because she wanted to, get revenge. She wanted to defeat Asnod because he's an enemy, but because she knew he tore his guts out. She knew that Byakuya's guts got torn out by Asnod, and she was going to get revenge for that. So she turned him, he was frostbitten after, he crumbled into, dust, essentially, because his body froze to death. But she did that, for her brother too, So I got her at number 7. I got 6, I got Shizuru. Shizuru from Yu Yu Hakusho. That's Kuwabara's sister. Unlike Yusuke's mom, she's kind of like there. She is there. She's saying, Kuwabara, go to school. Kuwabara, don't get in fights, don't get suspended. You'll be, you won't be able to go hang out with your friends, Kuwabara. You're going to stay here and actually do your homework. That type of thing. She's laying like ground rules on him and everything, because Kuwabara's still a boy and shit, right? But then when shit gets real in that world, right? And he's like, but sister, we won't even have a like place to come back to if Tagoro, and all them, they'll kill us if we don't go there. And he runs all that by her, and then, Yusuke's there and says, yeah, this shit's true. And then she's like, all right, we'll go to the dark tournament, and she's watching him, fight, and she's like, my brother's gonna do what he does, and, I'm cheering for him, I hope he, wins his fights. He lost the first one, and then he, ended up getting his ass whooped because he's just a guy that, I don't know, he just, like, does that. He's a cool guy, yes. He knew that those people were being controlled, and they really didn't want to fight him, but he was trying to get them to, show their true emotions, show that they still had their humanity about them, and they weren't just mindless zombies and shit. And then he beat Risho and them, and she was there for him then and everything. She was there for all that. She didn't go home and be like, oh no, this is, too much for me, and left. She didn't do that, and then she, saw him go through to high school and shit. She, made sure he was on his shit, even after all that shit was said and done. Yusuke might be doing shit somewhere else, but you are going to do this. And he did. And it was because she was there for him. And she ain't one that's thought of. But I knew about that because I know about Yu Yu Hakusho. But at number 5, I have Temari. Temari was there for her brothers, both of them. She was there for Kankuro too. She was there for, Gaara. Gaara was, she was fearful of Gaara, though. Gaara was, in possession of Tanuki and shit. And, he was, killing people. She was trying to calm him the fuck down. We seen him, she was able to, but like once he got to a certain point, she knew she couldn't do it, and she had to back off. At that point, she's in like, Kankuro, we have to, stay together and, make sure we're all right. Because our brother is going crazy, and we hope our brother can, deal with that shit. And he eventually was able to, deal with it. And they didn't write him off, though. They never wrote Gaara off as like, we want him dead. Nah, they didn't do that. She didn't do that. She stuck by him and everything. They might not have understood the pain he was going through and shit, but they were still there for him. She was still there for him. And then he died and came back, and Kankuro got poisoned. She was like, oh shit, Kankuro, he gets better or whatever. She stayed with him, you know, when she got back to the hidden or sand village. Then she's right by Gaara in the Five Kage Summit when Sasuke comes there to fuck shit up, and she's standing right beside him on the battlefield against Rasa and the other Five Kage and shit. She's standing right next to him and shit still. She, stood on business with her brother. They're seen together a lot. I got her at number 5. And out of sisters in like Naruto series, that's the only one I could think of. And at number 4, I have Towa from Yashahime. She's a half-breed demon like Inuyasha, but she's Inuyasha's niece and Sesshomaru's daughter, and the other daughter is Setsuna. So they got separated at birth, and she was sent to the Reiwa period, which is, the current times in, Tokyo, Japan, or wherever, right, in Japan. And she, was there for 10 years, but she always remembered Setsuna. Setsuna was lost. They got lost in the woods, and she got transported to, the modern era, right? Where Setsuna was still in the feudal era. And then she came back, and she's like, Setsuna, it's me, it's your sister. And she's like, huh? Oh, and Setsuna's kind of, whatever, because she's already, a demon slayer and doing her own thing. And she's like, you don't know the ways of this, and she don't care. Toa don't give a fuck. She does give a fuck, but she, is like, I'm just with my sister again, and that's what matters to me. And then she grows, closer to her sister. She sees her sister die, and she goes crazy. She goes feral, like Inuyasha did, against Karin Maru, who's like on par with Sesshomaru, and she's fighting against him, and she brings Setsuna back with Tenseiga, and then they're just close after that. She makes sure that they make sure that each other's taken care of, and they like stick by one another. She's always like, Setsuna is my sister, and we stand by each other, and she makes sure that happens. So she's at number 4. But at number 3, number 3 is Katara. Katara, she was with Sokka always. Sokka protected her earlier on, but then she became the one protecting him when they went on their journey with Aang. She protected her older brother because she had the powers to do so. The water bending and shit. He didn't have water bending. He had nothing. He had his boomerang, and that's it. And she knew that. It was a lot of pressure on her too. He knew that. He felt bad for it. But, for a while she was doing that, and she, continued to do that even after he learned skills, and she didn't hate Sokka, she didn't want to see her brother die, because she understood her brother was a guy trying to be like a Koda, not as good as a Koda, but wanted to learn, swordsmanship. She's like, hey, I ain't against it, you gotta do something in this group. And like kind of telling him to like do it, because you want to get better, so do it, and she was encouraging him to do it, and so he did. And, he became a swordsman, after that too. She wasn't against Sokka at any point in time, even when his relationship with Suki and Yue, she was there for him. She was like, that's cool, I like Avatar Aang, and they were just cool with each other. They didn't hate one another at all during the series. Azula and Zuko's relationship was nothing like that. They were like close. They had connection together. Unbreakable. But number 2 is Mirajane. Mirajane had to take up taking care of her younger brother Elfman and Lizana after their parents died. She had a demon arm. She had Saint soul matter. She became a demon. she took them to Fairy Tail and she was gonna leave them, but then they were like, "No, sister, we got the same powers as you, so we're gonna do the same shit." And then they stayed there. You know, Mirajane was kind of a tomboy a little bit at that time, where she, liked to, be a little more masculine and, beat up on people, and doing it because, hey, my brother and sister and, you people don't know us, and, and she's still trying to get a part of the guild. But eventually, Lizana died because Elfman went out of control. She didn't hate her brother for killing their sister, but really her sister didn't die, and that's the thing with Fairy Tail, Lizana didn't really die, but they thought she did. And Elfman hated himself, but she was like, no, you don't have to put it on yourself. I don't want to lose you too. You just can't use that form no more. And he was like, okay, I'll try to just not use it. But then eventually he used it again, and she was there for him. She was like, calm down, don't lose your mind. You don't want to hurt me. And then he was like, he came to his senses and shit. And then Lizana came back, and she, defended against Lizana and Tenor Island. Azuna had her in a fucking bomb, a bomb tracked to her chest, and she was like, I won't let that happen to my sister. She still lost that fight, but, she protected her sister. Still, they survived that ordeal. And then later on, during Tartaros, Elfman got possessed. And then she got him out of possession, and, they ended up fighting together, together against the demons of Tartaros. She was the glue of, like, her family. And she makes sure that she stays with her brothers and sisters, and they're good, they're taken care of in the guild. And then they know that she's also not just like their sister, but she's also a sister to the other people in the guild. They highly respect her because she's S-class wizard, and she's like, really nice and caring towards the other people in the guild. But she's actually like that with her brothers and sisters. Like when they're like in trouble and shit, she loses her shit. She's like, I won't let that happen to my brothers and sisters, like she should, and she's a good older sister. She's at number 2. But I got number 1, I have Sango at number 1. Because in Inuyasha, her character is about her finding her brother. Like, that's literally what it's about. Defeating Naraku, because Naraku has him in a bind. Like, this boy is like, a slave to him at first. He had him kill the Demon Slayer Corps, everybody except Sango. Try to have her kill Sango, but then, in the whole time he's trying to have her kill Sango, because, doing that would be, good for him. He likes to, fuck with people's lives and shit, but then he's like, no, I won't do it. And then Maasugi takes over his body towards the end of the season, and she's like, no, you gotta fight that shit. That happened, it did happen, but you still have me. And I've been, chasing after you to, like, wake you up this whole time. And people, we can still, create a future for each other, after this. You don't have to die and give your life away, to the, like, give the jewel shard up and, all that. He ended up surviving and becoming the leader of the Demon Slayer Corps. He respected his sister. She, made Kawaku want to be a Demon Slayer. Kawaku was, kind of, the younger brother, and he kind of didn't know how to do it at first. And then she was like, hey, this is how you do this, and this is how you do that. And then, she's just, somebody that he really, looked up to and inspired to be like. She took a back seat, though, because she got knocked up by Moroku, and she wasn't doing shit. She wasn't seeing the Haraikots no more. But he was, then the one to do that, and, they continued to live together, or not together, but, in the same world, protecting one another, But Kawaku, actually does respect his sister and shit, too. And she went through a lot of pain, because of Haku, but she knew that she wanted to not see him die, and she never wanted to kill him at any point in the series. Never. That wasn't even a fucking thought in her head. Be cool, Call in the corner, because that's the, ranking of the sisters in anime. And then tomorrow I have the brothers. So be cool, Call in the corner.